The morning of December 17, 1944, in the frozen Ardennes forest, a German panzer commander named Hauptmann Klaus Richter watched through his periscope as another American Sherman erupted in flames. His Tiger tank had just scored a direct hit at 1,200 meters. The Sherman's crew bailed out, disappearing into the tree line. Richter marked it on his map. Tank number 17, destroyed that week. But 20 minutes later, something impossible happened. That same Sherman, still smoking, still sitting in the same crater, suddenly roared back to life. Its engine bellowed, its turret traversed, and it began moving back into a fighting position. Richter couldn't believe what he was seeing. He grabbed his binoculars and focused on the damaged tank. There, crawling out from underneath the engine deck, was a single American soldier. Not a tank crewman, a mechanic, covered in grease and oil, carrying a toolbox, completely exposed to German fire. The sergeant, whose name was James Walker, though Richter would never know it, calmly walked back to his recovery vehicle as if he were leaving a garage in Detroit, not a battlefield where men were dying. That Sherman would go on to destroy 2 German tanks that afternoon. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across Europe, and it drove German commanders absolutely insane. They couldn't understand how American tank forces kept growing stronger no matter how many Shermans they destroyed. German intelligence reports from late 1944 speak of encountering 50 to 60,000 American tanks in Europe, yet the Americans had only shipped 40,000. The math didn't add up. Unless ... what the Germans were witnessing wasn't an endless supply of new tanks. They were fighting the same tanks over and over again. Killed in the morning, resurrected by noon, back in the fight by afternoon. This is the story of how one sergeant's wrench became more powerful than any German 88mm gun. How American mechanics turned battlefield maintenance into a weapon that multiplied American tank forces by resurrection. And how the United States won the armor war, not by building better tanks, but by refusing to let any tank stay dead. The story starts, not on the battlefield, but in the design rooms of 1940 Detroit, where engineers were about to make a decision that would change warfare forever. When America entered World War II in December 1941, the U.S. Army faced a terrifying reality. Germany's panzer divisions had just conquered most of Europe using tanks that were, by almost every measure, superior to anything America had. The German Tiger I was a 56-ton beast with 100 millimeters of frontal armor and an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The Panther, introduced in 1943, combined speed with a devastating 75mm high-velocity gun and sloped armor that could deflect most American shells. The American M4 Sherman, 33 tons, maximum 76mm of frontal armor on early models. A 75mm gun that could barely penetrate a Tiger's armor, even at point-blank range. In a single tank duel, the German tanks won almost every time. American tankers knew this brutal mathematics. Lieutenant Belton Cooper of the 3rd Armored Division later wrote, "The Sherman crew was told that our 75mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's armor at 500 yards. They forgot to tell us we had to get to within 500 yards first and the Tiger could kill us at 2,000. But here's what the German High Command fatally underestimated. Wars aren't won by whoever builds the perfect weapon. Wars are won by whoever can keep their weapons fighting the longest. And the Americans had designed the Sherman with a philosophy that was completely foreign to German engineering culture. Every Sherman component was designed to be repairable. Not in a factory, not in a workshop, but in a muddy field, under artillery fire, by a mechanic with basic tools. The engine, mounted on rails. 2 men with a crane could swap an entire engine in under 2 hours. German tanks required specialized lifting equipment and days of work. The transmission, bolted to the front of the tank. Remove a few bolts, disconnect 3 linkages, and the entire powertrain, transmission, differential, and final drives could be replaced as a single unit. German Panthers had transmissions that required pulling the entire turret to access the suspension. Each bogie assembly was a modular unit. Break a track, lose a road wheel. 20 minutes with a sledgehammer and crowbar, and you're rolling again. German tanks used interleaved road wheels that froze solid in winter mud and took hours to repair. Even the Sherman's much maligned gasoline engine was chosen partly for maintainability. Yes, gasoline was more flammable than diesel, but every American soldier knew how to work on a gasoline engine. Every supply depot had gasoline engine parts, and the specific radial aircraft engine they chose, the Continental. Our 975 was so simple that mechanics called it agriculturally reliable. Did you know that Sherman tanks used commercial truck transmissions? Barely modified, the famous Spicer manual synchromesh transmission was essentially the same unit used in heavy trucks across America. This wasn't a flaw, it was brilliant design. It meant spare parts were everywhere, and any mechanic who'd worked on a Mack truck could maintain a Sherman. But hardware alone doesn't win wars. The Americans did something else that the Germans considered almost crazy. They trained mechanics to fight at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds and Fort Knox. American combat mechanics underwent training that seemed insane even to the tankers. They were taught to diagnose engine problems while instructors fired live ammunition over their heads. They practiced track repairs while smoke grenades exploded around them. They learned to work in complete darkness, relying only on touch. They trained until they could swap a final drive in under an hour while wearing gas masks. Most importantly, they were trained with a philosophy that seemed to contradict all military logic. Get it working now, fix it right later. This concept, what we'd now call good enough engineering, was anathema to German perfectionism. But it was devastatingly effective. A Sherman with a damaged cooling system, bypass it, patch the hole with whatever metal you can find. Get it running. It might only last for 6 more hours, but 6 hours in combat could mean the difference between victory and defeat. A blown gasket. Scavenge one from a knocked-out tank. Strip parts from 3 dead Shermans to make 2 running ones. Meanwhile, across the lines, German tank crews waited days or weeks for replacement parts that met exact factory specifications. When those parts never arrived because Allied bombing had destroyed the factories, German tanks sat abandoned. Mechanically perfect but utterly useless. By June 1944, when American forces landed in Normandy, the German army still fielded superior tanks. But they were about to discover they were fighting an enemy that refused to stay dead. The hedgerows of Normandy provided the first brutal demonstration. The bosquets, thick hedgerows that divided French farmland into a maze of small fields, became killing zones. German anti-tank guns waited behind every hedge. Sherman, after Sherman, was knocked out, often before even seeing the enemy. By traditional military logic, these destroyed tanks should have been written off, abandoned, stripped for parts, maybe, but never returned to service. But the Americans didn't abandon anything they could resurrect. This is where our story truly begins. With men like Sergeant James Walker, whose war was about to become far more terrifying than any tankers, because Walker wasn't going to fight the Germans from inside an armored vehicle, he was going to repair those vehicles while the Germans were actively trying to kill him. The first time Sergeant James Walker crawled under a Sherman while German machine guns stitched the ground 50 meters away, he thought he was going to die. It was June 18, 1944, 12 days after D-Day. His unit, the 743rd Tank Battalion's maintenance platoon, had just arrived in Normandy. The hedgerows were held. In the first week, his battalion had lost 23 tanks, destroyed, and another 31 damaged. The damaged tanks, according to pre-war doctrine, should have been towed back to England for depot-level repairs. But there was a problem. The replacement tanks coming from England couldn't arrive fast enough. At this rate, the battalion would be combat ineffective within 2 weeks. So Walker's commanding officer, Captain Robert Morrison, made a decision that broke every regulation in the book. They would repair the tanks in the field. Not safe repair. Mind you, not even smart repair. Emergency battlefield resurrection. And they'd do it close enough to the front lines that German artillery could reach them. That first morning, Walker was assigned to repair an M4A1 Sherman that had thrown a track after hitting a mine. The tank sat in an exposed position, visible from German lines 300 meters away. The crew had bailed out when a German MG-42 machine gun opened fire on them. Walker's job was to crawl out there, alone, and repair that track. "You've got 30 minutes, Morrison told him. "After that, Jerry will have his mortar ranged on that position, and you're dead." Walker grabbed his tools, a sledgehammer, 2 crowbars, track pins, and a block and tackle. He crawled on his stomach through the mud, dragging his equipment, while German small arms fire sporadically cracked overhead. When he reached the tank, he could hear German voices shouting from the hedgerow. They'd spotted him. He had minutes, maybe less, before they called an indirect fire. The track had been blown completely off. 3 road wheels were damaged, but still functional. The idler wheel was fine. In training, this repair took an experienced crew 45 minutes. Walker was alone and under fire. His hands shook as he hammered the first track pin into place. 12 minutes later, a mortar round exploded 40 meters behind the tank. The Germans had started ranging fire. Walker didn't stop working. 23 minutes after crawling out, Walker had the track reconnected. He didn't bother checking tension or alignment. That could wait. He signaled to the crew hiding in the tree line. The driver sprinted back, climbed in, and fired up the engine. The Sherman's engine bellowed. The track held. The tank rolled backward into cover. Walker sprinted back to his recovery vehicle, German bullets kicking up dirt around his boots. That Sherman was back in combat 4 hours later. It would fight for another 6 weeks before being knocked out by a Panther's 75mm gun, at which point another mechanic would repair it again. This became Walker's life. He'd repair 3 or 4 tanks every day, sometimes under direct fire, sometimes in the dark, sometimes in the rain, while waist-deep in mud. But Walker was just one man in a massive, invisible army. Did you know that for every combat tank battalion, the U.S. Army assigned an entire ordnance maintenance company? That's roughly 1 mechanic for every 3 tanks. The Germans, by comparison, had one mechanic for every 10 to 12 tanks, and those mechanics operated from rear area workshops, not the front lines. The American maintenance companies moved with the combat units. When a Sherman was hit, recovery vehicles were often on scene within 20 minutes. Their job was simple: assess the damage and either repair it immediately or tow it back to a field maintenance area just behind the front lines. These field maintenance areas were remarkable operations. Imagine a massive open-air garage, positioned 2 to 5 kilometers behind the front, close enough that German artillery could reach them, but far enough that they weren't in direct line of sight. Here, teams of mechanics worked around the clock. Damaged tanks would arrive, be triaged like patients in an emergency room, and then rushed through repair. Minor damage: thrown tracks, damaged wheels, bullet holes, periscope damage were fixed in under an hour. Moderate damage: engine problems, transmission issues, damaged weapons systems took 4 to 6 hours. Major damage: engine replacement, hull repairs, turret work might take 12 to 24 hours. But here's the shocking statistic. In prolonged European combat operations, American maintenance units could return 60 to 70% of damaged tanks to service within 24 hours. Compare that to the Germans, who might manage 20 to 30% in a week. The numbers tell an extraordinary story. The 3rd Armored Division's maintenance records from the Battle of the Bulge show they had 648 Sherman tanks completely destroyed during the European campaign, but they also had another 700 knocked out, repaired, and returned to combat. Some individual tanks were knocked out and repaired 4 or 5 times. Let me repeat that. Some Sherman tanks were destroyed half a dozen times and kept coming back. From the German perspective, this was incomprehensible. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, the panzer commander we met earlier, wrote in his diary in January 1945, "We destroyed at least 40 American tanks this week, yet they attack with more tanks than they had at the start of the week. Where are they coming from? Our intelligence says the Americans have unlimited production, but I think something else is happening. I think we are fighting ghost tanks that refuse to die." He was closer to the truth than he realized. But the mechanics weren't just performing miracles with wrenches. They were innovating on the battlefield, solving problems that engineers back in Detroit had never anticipated. Take Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division. In July 1944, he was a 29-year-old reconnaissance sergeant, older than most, a bit of a tinkerer. The hedgerow problem was killing American tankers. Every time a Sherman tried to climb over a hedgerow, it exposed its thin belly armor to German anti-tank guns waiting on the other side. Culin watched this happening over and over, and then he had an idea. He took salvaged German beach obstacles, the steel check hedgehogs that the Germans had planted on Omaha Beach to stop landing craft, and welded them to the front of a Sherman tank, creating steel tusks that could rip through the dense hedgerow roots. Instead of climbing over them, he tested it one morning without permission. The Sherman tore through a hedgerow like a hot knife through butter, staying level, keeping its thick frontal armor toward the enemy. Within 2 weeks, General Omar Bradley had ordered every available tank in Normandy to be equipped with coolant cutters or similar hedgerow cutting devices. Workshops behind the lines worked 24/7. Mechanics scrounged steel from destroyed German obstacles, cut it with torches, and welded it onto Shermans. By the end of July, thousands of tanks had been modified. American armor could finally maneuver through the Buk. The Normandy stalemate was broken not by new tactics or new tanks, but by a sergeant with a welding torch. The Germans never adapted. Their tank doctrine didn't allow for field modifications. Everything had to go through official channels, be tested, be approved. By the time German engineers proposed solutions to the hedgerow problem, American forces had already broken through and were racing across France. But perhaps the most shocking example of American battlefield ingenuity comes from the Battle of the Bulge in December 19. The Ardennes offensive caught American forces completely off guard. German panzer divisions, spearheaded by Tigers and Panthers, smashed through thinly held American lines. The weather was the coldest in decades. Snow and ice covered everything, and American tanks started failing, not from enemy fire, but from the cold. Sherman engines wouldn't start in -20 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. Oil turned to sludge. Coolant froze and cracked engine blocks. Batteries died. Within 48 hours, more American tanks were out of action from mechanical failure than from German guns. This is where mechanic ingenuity reached almost absurd levels. Mechanics began constructing improvised heaters from ration cans and gasoline. They'd place these crude heaters under engine compartments overnight to keep the oil fluid. Dangerous, absolutely. Some tanks caught fire, but the alternative was sitting immobile while German tanks advanced. They drained oil from engines every night and stored it in heated tents, then refilled the engines in the morning with warm oil so they could start. They removed batteries and kept them in heated recovery vehicles overnight, then reinstalled them at dawn. They even developed a trick of pouring gasoline onto the engine compartment, igniting it briefly to heat the metal, then starting the engine while it was still warm. This hot start procedure wasn't in any manual. It was invented by desperate mechanics in frozen forests. These improvised solutions kept the American tank units mobile during the Bulge, while German forces who had planned their offensive around speed began to bog down. German tanks ran out of fuel because supply lines couldn't keep up. Many German Panthers and Tigers were abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because they'd broken down and couldn't be repaired in the field. Meanwhile, American maintenance units were performing miracles. Let me tell you about Captain Robert Morrison's maintenance team during the siege at Bastogne. Morrison commanded a 40-man ordnance maintenance platoon attached to the 10th Armored Division. When Bastogne was surrounded, his unit was trapped inside the perimeter with 2 armored battalions, about 90 Sherman tanks. After 3 days of fighting, only 25 of those tanks were still operational. Ammunition was running low, but that wasn't the critical shortage. They needed working tanks. Morrison made a decision that everyone, including his own men, thought was suicidal. They would establish a field repair facility inside the encircled perimeter, less than a kilometer from German lines, and work around the clock to resurrect every damaged tank they could. For the next 4 days, his mechanics worked in conditions that defy belief. They operated in -15 degrees Fahrenheit weather. German artillery was constantly bracketing their position. They had limited light, using any bright lighting would draw immediate fire. They worked by feel as much as by sight, replacing tracks in the dark, swapping engines using muscle power because crane trucks couldn't operate on icy ground, patching bullet holes with scrounged metal from knocked-out German vehicles. The easy repairs came first. Track damage fixed in 30 minutes. Thrown road wheels. 20 minutes. Electrical problems. Bypass the damage and get it working. But then came the hard ones. Tanks with damaged transmissions. Engines with cracked blocks. Turrets jammed from structural hits. For these, Morrison employed what he called cannibalization, a term that would make German engineers weep. Take 3 destroyed tanks and create 2 running tanks. Pull the transmission from Tank A, the engine from Tank B, the turret drive from Tank C, and install them in Tanks D and E. It was ugly. It wasn't elegant. By the book, German engineers would have been horrified at the lack of precision, the mixing of parts from different production runs, the absolute disregard for maintenance protocols. But it worked. In 6 days, Morrison's team returned 45 tanks to operational status, almost half of what they'd started with tanks that by German standards would have been permanent losses. When the Germans launched their assault on December 25th, expecting to overrun a handful of desperate defenders, they instead faced 70 operational American tanks. The assault was repulsed. Morrison received the Bronze Star, but more importantly, his maintenance doctrine was copied across every American armored unit in Europe. The Germans never understood what they were facing. Their intelligence reports from January 1945 show increasing frustration. They estimated they'd destroyed between 1,500 and 2,000 American tanks in the Ardennes, yet American forces seemed to have more tanks at the end of the battle than at the beginning. German commanders assumed this meant unlimited American production. They were wrong. What they were witnessing was resurrection. Every tank they destroyed in the morning might be back in the fight by evening. Kill it again, and it returns the next day with a new engine. Every damaged Sherman was potential reinforcement. This drove German tactical planning insane. How do you calculate force ratios when the enemy's destroyed tanks don't stay destroyed? And here's the devastating irony. The Germans had built superior tanks. The Panther was probably the best medium tank of the war. The Tiger, pound for pound, was nearly invincible in single combat. But when a Panther threw a track, it might be out of action for a week. When a Tiger's transmission failed they failed constantly. That tank was effectively gone. German mechanics simply couldn't keep pace with the demands of mobile warfare. By March 1945, entire panzer divisions were reporting tank availability rates below 30%. Not from enemy action, from breakdowns and inability to repair. The American 3rd Armored Division at the same time reported 85% tank availability. The math was simple and brutal. The Germans were fielding superior tanks that rarely worked. The Americans were fielding inferior tanks that always worked. And, in sustained warfare, always working beats technically superior every single time. Now we come back to Sergeant James Walker in that frozen morning in December 1944 that would define what American maintenance doctrine had become. Walker's platoon had just arrived at a defensive position near Elsenborn Ridge. The German offensive had punched through American lines, and his unit was part of the desperate attempt to hold the northern shoulder of the Bulge. That morning, 3 Sherman tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion had engaged a column of German Panthers at close range. The Americans got the worst of it. 2 Shermans were knocked out completely, burning wrecks with dead crews. The 3rd Sherman took a hit to the engine compartment. The crew bailed out as black smoke billowed from the engine deck. The tank sat immobilized, 200 meters forward of American lines, clearly visible to German positions. By doctrine, that tank should have been written off. Too exposed to recover. Too damaged to be worth the risk. But Walker's commanding officer, Captain Morrison, saw something the Germans didn't. The tank's gun was still functional. Its turret could still traverse. And critically, it was positioned in a natural hold-down position that covered the main approach route. German armor would have to use if that tank could be made mobile again, or even just get its engine running to power the turret and radio. It would be worth 3 stationary anti-tank guns. Morrison called Walker over. "I need that tank working." Walker looked at the smoking Sherman. German lines were maybe 300 meters away. There was no cover between their position and the tank. "I can't work on it there, sir. I'll be exposed the whole time." "I know," Morrison said, "but we need that gun covering this approach. If the Germans attack in the next hour and that tank isn't firing, this position gets overrun." Walker felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a repair. It was a suicide mission with tools. But he understood the mathematics as well as Morrison did. If he didn't go, good men as friends would die. When German tanks rolled through that gap, he grabbed his tool bag and started organizing what he'd need. Basic tools, wrenches, pliers, wire cutters, a spare coolant hose, because that's what had probably failed. Clean rags. His canteen, because working in extreme cold makes you desperately thirsty. "I'll need covering fire," Walker said. "The second I'm visible, Germans are going to start shooting." Morrison nodded. He'd already positioned DeBar gunners and 3 M1919 machine guns to suppress German positions. Not enough to stop them from shooting, but enough to make them nervous about showing themselves. At 0820 hours, Walker crawled out. The first 50 meters, he stayed in the slight depression that provided concealment. But then the ground leveled, and he was fully exposed. He could hear German voices carried on the cold wind. They'd seen him. The first shots came at 100 meters. German Mauser rifles, the distinctive crack 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 of aimed fire. American machine guns opened up in response, forcing the Germans down. Walker kept crawling. Dragging his tool bag, he reached the Sherman at 08:299 minutes of crawling through snow, completely exposed, while German and American guns dueled overhead. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd thought. The German 75mm shell had penetrated the engine deck at an angle, fragmenting inside the engine compartment. Coolant was leaking, oil was everywhere, and he could see jagged metal where shrapnel had torn through hoses and cables. This wasn't a 30-minute fix. This was hours of work. Walker made a split-second decision. He wasn't going to fix this tank properly. He was going to get it alive long enough to matter. He opened his tool bag and began triaging the damage. The engine oil system was damaged but not destroyed. He could bypass the damaged lines. The coolant system was shot, but the engine would run for maybe 20 minutes without coolant before overheating. The electrical system had taken shrapnel damage, but the starter motor still worked. He started pulling out damaged components and bypassing systems. German mortar fire started falling at 0835. The Germans had called an indirect fire, trying to range on the tank's position. The first rounds landed 50 meters short. The second salvo landed 30 meters over. They were bracketing the target. Walker's hands moved faster. He ripped out the damaged coolant hoses entirely and plugged the connections. No coolant was better than leaking coolant. The engine would run hot, but it would run. He spliced the damaged oil lines using wire and spare hose, creating a Frankenstein's monster of battlefield repair that no engineer would approve, but that might work for an hour. At 0844, a mortar round exploded 15 meters from the tank. Shrapnel screamed off the Sherman's armor. Walker felt something hit his leg, a fragment that tore through his trousers, but only grazed the skin. He kept working. The electrical system was the hardest part. The wiring harness had been shredded. He couldn't repair it. He'd had to bypass it entirely. He pulled out wire cutters and began hot wiring the ignition, connecting the battery directly to the starter motor. American machine gun fire intensified. The German infantry were trying to move forward under cover of their mortar fire, probably to finish off the exposed mechanic. At 085131. Minutes after crawling out to the tank, Walker reconnected the last wire, said a prayer to whatever mechanical gods might be listening, and signaled thumbs up to the tree line the Sherman's crew had been waiting. The driver, a kid named Peterson, who couldn't have been more than 19, sprinted from cover and dove through the driver's hatch. "Start her up," Walker yelled. Peterson hit the starter. The engine cranked once, twice. It caught the Continental R975, roared to life, belching blue smoke from the bypass repairs, running rough and loud but running. "She's hot," Peterson yelled. "Temperature's already in the red. You've got 15 minutes before she cooks herself," Walker shouted back. "Make them count." The rest of the crew sprinted from cover. Gunner, loader, commander, they piled into the tank. The turret began traversing, the 75mm gun coming online. Walker didn't wait around. He grabbed his tool bag and ran. German machine gun fire stitched across his path. American covering fire responded. Walker zigged, running faster than he'd ever run in his life, legs pumping, lungs burning in the cold air. He dove into the American trench at 0854, slamming into the frozen earth hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Behind him, The Sherman's gun fired, the distinctive boom of the 75 millimeters. Then again, and again. Walker lay in the trench, gasping for breath, while the tank he'd just resurrected began engaging German armor, advancing through the morning fog. That Sherman fired 17 rounds before its engine seized at 911, exactly 19 minutes after Walker had started it. It knocked out one Panther and damaged 2 more before its engine died from overheating. But those 19 minutes were enough. The German attack faltered. By the time German forces reorganized for another assault, American reinforcements had arrived to strengthen the position. The German panzer commander, who'd been watching through his periscope our friend, Klaus, Richter, couldn't process what he'd just witnessed. A tank his forces had knocked out, repaired under fire by a single man with a toolbox, brought back to life, and returned to combat in under 40 minutes. He wrote in his diary that night, "The Americans have mechanized resurrection. We destroy their tanks, and they refuse to die. This is not war, as I understand it. This is something else entirely." He was right. It was something else. It was the American doctrine of aggressive battlefield maintenance, pushed to its absolute limit by men who refused to accept that machinery, once broken, must stay broken. Walker was later awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against an armed enemy." But the medal didn't mention what made his actions extraordinary, that he hadn't fired a single shot. His weapon had been wrenched out 3 weeks later. Walker was killed by German artillery while repairing another tank. He was 23 years old. In his 10 months of combat service, he'd personally repaired or helped repair over 40 tanks. Those tanks went on to fight, to protect other soldiers, to break through German lines. How many American lives did James Walker save? Impossible to calculate, dozens, hundreds. But his story multiplied across thousands of mechanics, and you begin to understand how America won the armor war. The final statistics of the European armor campaign tell a story that raw technical specifications never could. The United States produced approximately 50 Sherman tanks during World War II. About 40,000 of these were shipped to the European theater. Roughly 20,000 were destroyed or lost beyond recovery during the campaign. But here's the number that matters. American armored divisions consistently maintained combat readiness between 80 and 90%. Throughout sustained operations, Germany produced about 6,000 Tiger tanks and 8,000 Panthers, technologically superior to the Sherman in almost every way. Yet German panzer divisions rarely achieved combat readiness above 60%, and by 1945, that number had dropped to below 30%. The difference wasn't production, it was resurrection. A captured German logistics report from March 1945 provides extraordinary insight. German analysts had been tracking American tank losses and couldn't make the math work. Their count of destroyed American tanks exceeded 60,000 yet. American forces seemed to grow stronger, the report concluded. The Americans possess either unlimited production capacity or have developed a system of repair and recovery that we cannot match. Recommend immediate study of American maintenance doctrine. That study never happened. Germany surrendered 2 months later. But what happened to the men who created this maintenance miracle? Captain Robert Morrison, who led that desperate repair operation during the siege of Bastogne, survived the war. He returned to Oklahoma, opened an auto repair shop, and rarely spoke about his service. He died in 1992. At his funeral, 7 elderly men showed up, mechanics from his wartime platoon, who'd traveled from across the country to honor the officer, who'd led them through hell with wrenches instead of rifles. Sergeant Curtis Cooper, whose hedgerow cutter innovation changed the Normandy campaign, went home to New York City. He married in 1945 and worked as a cab driver for 30 years. He never sought publicity for his invention. When asked about it later in life, he reportedly said, "I just didn't want to see any more of our boys die in those hedgerows." Kalin died in 1963. Obituary mentioned his tank innovation. In a single sentence, the thousands of other mechanics who kept American armor rolling, men like James Walker mostly, disappeared into post-war civilian life. Many worked in auto repair shops, bringing their hard-won expertise to fixing Chevrolets and Fords. Some became engineers, applying their battlefield problem-solving to peacetime industries. Very few received recognition. Mechanics didn't get parades. They didn't have movies made about them. History remembers the generals who planned campaigns and the tankers who fought battles. Rarely the mechanics who made those battles possible, but their legacy lived on in doctrine. After the war, the U.S. Army formalized everything these mechanics had invented under fire. Field maintenance became a cornerstone of American military philosophy. Every armored unit received robust maintenance support. Every military vehicle was designed from the ground up, with field repair in mind. The good enough to fight mentality became official policy. Don't wait for perfect repairs. Get the weapon system functional now, optimize it later. This doctrine spread worldwide. NATO forces adopted American maintenance practices. Even the Soviet Union, after studying American methods through Lend-Lease Sherman, reformed their maintenance systems along American lines. Today, Modern militaries take for granted that vehicles can be repaired under combat conditions. The U.S. Army has forward support companies and brigade support battalions whose job is essentially what Morrison's mechanics did in 1944, aggressive battlefield repair. Modern Abrams tanks, Bradley, fighting vehicles, and Strykers are all designed with the same philosophy that governed the Sherman: modular components, standardized parts, rapid field replacement. When an Abrams throws a track in Afghanistan or Iraq, the crew can have it repaired in under an hour using the same basic techniques Walker used in 1944. When an engine fails, a maintenance team can swap the entire power pack in 4 hours. The technology has changed. The philosophy hasn't. There's a profound lesson here that extends beyond military history. The Germans built beautiful tanks, marvels of engineering, technical masterpieces, and they lost. The Americans built good enough tanks, crude by comparison, inferior in single combat, and they won. Because the Americans understood something the Germans didn't. In sustained conflict, availability beats superiority. The weapon system that keeps working is better than the weapon system that works better. This principle applies far beyond warfare. In business, in technology, in any competitive field, the ability to keep functioning, to adapt, to repair, and return to the fight often matters more than having the perfect product. Silicon Valley calls it fail fast. The Marine Corps calls it bias toward action. Mechanics in 1944 called it get it running now, fix it right later. But perhaps the most important legacy of these mechanics is simpler than doctrine or philosophy. They prove that heroism isn't just charging into battle. Sometimes it's crawling out to fix the machine that others will charge into battle with. They showed that an unglamorous wrench, wielded by the right person at the right time, can be as powerful as any gun. They demonstrated that support personnel, the ones who keep the fighters fighting, are just as crucial to victory as the fighters themselves. And they did all of this while being shot at, frozen, exhausted, and largely forgotten by history. Until now. When Klaus Richter, the German panzer commander, whose diary we've quoted throughout this story, was finally captured in April 1945, American intelligence officers interrogated him about German tank tactics. He gave detailed answers about gun ranges, armor thickness, crew training, but then he said something that stopped the interrogators cold. "We lost the armor war the moment we made perfection the enemy of function," Richter said. "We built tanks that could defeat anything one-on-one. You built tanks that could be repaired by one man with a toolbox. In the end, your philosophy was superior to our engineering." The interrogation officer noted this comment but didn't fully understand it. The report was filed and forgotten. But Richter had identified the fundamental truth of mechanized warfare. Wars are not won by whoever builds the best weapon. Wars are won by whoever can keep their weapons in the fight longest. The American mechanics of World War II men, like James Walker, Robert Morrison, Curtis Cullen, and thousands whose names we'll never know, understood this instinctively. They didn't have the luxury of perfect repairs or optimal conditions. They had muddy fields, frozen forests, and German artillery. So they improvised. They bypassed, they cannibalized, they hot-wired and jury-rigged and patched and prayed, and they turned the American Sherman, a tank that lost most of its one-on-one duels with German armor, into the most effective tank force in history through sheer operational persistence. The Sherman tank fought in every American battle in Europe and the Pacific. It served with British, Soviet, French, Chinese, and dozens of other Allied forces. It remained in frontline service with some armies into the 1970s, not because it was the best tank, because it was the tank that refused to quit. Just like the mechanics who kept it running. In a quiet cemetery in New Jersey, there's a gravestone for Sergeant James Walker. The inscription reads, "Beloved son and brother, killed in action, January 1945. It doesn't mention the 40 tanks he repaired, the hundreds of lives he saved, the battles that were won because he crawled into danger with a toolbox instead of a rifle. His story, and stories like his, are why the United States won World War II, not through superior firepower, not through better technology, not through brilliant generals or unstoppable warriors, but through ordinary men who did extraordinary things with wrenches and determination. Men who understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not fighting, but ensuring that others can continue the fight. Men who proved that every role in war matters, that the soldier who keeps the machine running is just as heroic as the soldier who fires the gun. When you think about World War II heroes, remember the tankers who fought the battles. Remember the generals who won the campaigns. But also remember the mechanics, the ones who worked under fire while everyone else took cover. The ones who got greasy and cold and exhausted, keeping metal monsters alive. The ones who multiplied American combat power not through violence, but through stubborn, relentless refusal to let anything stay broken, because in the end, that's what won the war. Not the men who broke things, but the men who fixed them.